Have you ever seen a hero ignored, a check shredded, and justice served in minutes? This is Valor Stories, and today, we bring you an incredible tale of resilience. Sir, this paper feels wrong. The numbers are off. I'm going to have to destroy this. The young teller said. Harold Monroe, a war veteran who had seen jungles, deserts, and decades of silence from the government that once saluted him, placed both hands on the counter. That's a U.S. Treasury check, young lady. It's real. It's earned. And I've waited half my life for it. She didn't even blink. With a snap and a mechanical whir, the check disappeared into the shredder. His hopes gone in strips of paper. She didn't know who he was. But 5 minutes later, when two black sedans stopped outside, when federal agents stormed the glass doors, she learned exactly what happens when you shred a soldier's lifeline. And the man behind that paper calls the Treasury. Harold Monroe didn't draw attention. He wasn't the kind of man people noticed in a crowd, and he preferred it that way. At 80, his back was a little stooped, his hands calloused from years of wrench turning and crate lifting, and his eyes, the weary, still held the sharpness of someone who had once read terrain maps under moonlight and mortar fire. A retired Army veteran, Harold had served quietly without fanfare. He had done 2 long tours near the Korean demilitarized zone in the 1960s and then returned for another chapter in logistics during Desert Storm. He wasn't the one who pulled the trigger. He was the one who made sure the man pulling it had the right ammunition, the right fuel, the right gear. In the military, that meant everything. These days, Harold lived alone in a faded aluminum trailer, parked on the edge of Bakersfield, California, the kind of neighborhood where the mailboxes leaned and the dogs barked more at the wind than at strangers. He didn't complain. The VA disability checks were small but steady until now. Because for over 20 years, Harold had been fighting a different kind of battle, a bureaucratic one. After Desert Storm, symptoms began creeping in. Coughing fits, skin lesions, nerve pain that flared without warning. Doctors speculated, and Harold suspected Agent Orange, a ghost from Vietnam still lingering decades later. Like thousands of others, he filed a claim with the VA. And like thousands of others, he waited and waited. There were letters, then silence, then letters asking for documents he'd already submitted, then delays, more reviews. Then finally, in 2023, amid growing public pressure and backlogs that topped 200,000 unresolved cases, the Department of Veterans Affairs reopened long-lost files. Harold's name was in one of them. It turned out his exposure during a forgotten supply mission near the Kuwaiti border met the criteria. After years of waiting, they approved his retroactive disability compensation, more than $76,000 in back pay. For Harold, it was life-changing. Not just money, but validation. Proof that someone somewhere had finally said, "We see you. You matter." He could finally fix the sagging roof on his trailer, pay off the lingering medical bills he had quietly ignored, and maybe, just maybe, buy a bus ticket to Oregon and visit his daughter and 10-year-old grandson, Caleb, whom he'd never met in person. On the morning he received the check, Harold did what he always did. He got up early, shaved with care, and pressed his best shirt. He placed the check gently into an envelope along with his VA ID and driver's license. Then he headed for the Consolidated Trust Bank, his bank for over 40 years, expecting nothing more than a quiet transaction. He wasn't looking for applause. He wasn't chasing a headline. But the world was about to see him, whether it wanted to or not. It came in a plain white envelope. But Harold Monroe knew before he opened it that something was different. The weight of it, the embossing, the bold font on the top left corner. U.S. Department of the Treasury. After all these years, he recognized the mark of a government that finally, if reluctantly, remembered. Inside was a check for $76,400. Harold didn't speak when he saw the number. He simply sat down at the small Formica kitchen table in his trailer, the one with the chipped corner and the sun-bleached placemat, and let out a long breath. He reread the letter twice. The phrasing was formal, distant, bureaucratic, retroactive compensation determined eligible approved under expanded Agent Orange exposure guidelines. But what it meant was simple, finally. For decades, Harold had quietly carried the burden of waiting, shuffled between appeals, evaluations, and silence. Every time he called the VA hotline, it was another loop through a department that couldn't confirm or needed more paperwork. At some point, he stopped getting angry. He just endured like so many others. But now the check was real, tangible, and with it came possibilities. He made a list on a yellow notepad. Patch the leaking roof before another Bakersfield winter made it worse. Pay off the overdue medical bills he'd been ignoring. Replace the busted water heater. And this one he underlined: visit Maggie and Caleb. His daughter Maggie had moved to Eugene, Oregon over a decade ago. Life had pulled them apart. Distance, misunderstandings, the kind of slow-growing silence that becomes hard to break. She had a son now, 10 years old. Caleb had seen Harold only in old photos and occasional video calls with a grainy signal. Now Harold could buy a ticket, bring a gift, show up with dignity. He didn't rush. The next morning, he rose early, ironed his only good shirt, and slid the check into a manila envelope along with his VA ID and driver's license. He checked the bus schedule to Oregon, but didn't book anything yet. First, he needed to deposit the check. He made his way to the Consolidated Trust Bank, the same one he'd used since 1983. They had moved locations once, changed logos twice, and swapped out tellers more times than he could count. But Harold had never considered going anywhere else. Loyalty mattered to him. Habit did, too. As he walked through the glass doors, he nodded to the security guard and stepped into line. The midday crowd was light. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. He waited, patient as ever, envelope tucked firmly under his arm. This wasn't supposed to be a big day, just a small errand, one check, one deposit, one quiet step toward a long-awaited moment with his family. But instead, this would become the day everything changed again, and not for the reason Harold expected. The bank lobby was unusually busy for a weekday morning. A faint scent of printer ink hung in the cool air, mingling with the muted tapping of keyboards and the hum of an aging HVAC unit overhead. The walls were clean, beige, and forgettable, like the kind of place designed to feel safe but impersonal. Harold Monroe waited patiently in line, the manila envelope containing his check clutched in both hands. He glanced at the other customers, young professionals, retirees, a mother rocking a stroller. None of them paid him any mind. Just an old man in a weathered army jacket standing a little straighter than most folks his age. When it was finally his turn, the teller who called him forward couldn't have been more than 24. Her name tag read Emma, and her bright smile had the polish of someone trained to be friendly but not warm. She looked up at him with practiced pleasantness that faded almost instantly when she saw what he was holding. Harold greeted her with a polite nod. "Good morning, ma'am. I'd like to deposit this check, please." He slid the envelope toward her, and she opened it with a flick of her fingers. The moment her eyes fell on the bold black print and government seal, her expression shifted. "This is quite a large amount," she said, blinking. "Yes, ma'am. It's retroactive disability pay from the VA." Emma held the check up to the light, examining it like it might be laced with poison. She ran it under a small UV scanner, then turned back to her screen and began typing. Her smile didn't return. "I'm sorry, sir, but this check is highly irregular," she said, her tone flattening into corporate protocol. "The paper doesn't feel standard. The routing numbers are off format, and this signature, it doesn't match the usual VA disbursement styles we see." Harold raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, that check came from the Department of Veterans Affairs. It's a U.S. Treasury document. You're welcome to call and verify it." "I don't need to," Emma replied briskly. "We have procedures for handling potentially fraudulent instruments, and this," she tapped the check with one finger, "raises too many red flags." Harold reached into his coat and laid his veteran's ID and driver's license on the counter. "My name is on that check. These match. I've been banking here longer than you've been alive." Emma barely glanced at the cards. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm going to have to destroy this." Harold stared at her. "I beg your pardon." "It's policy," she said, her voice cool and sure. "When a check is deemed suspicious, it must be voided and removed from circulation. That includes shredding." We can't risk it being presented again elsewhere." Before he could reply, she turned to the heavy-duty shredder beside her desk. A machine clearly meant for internal documents, and with one motion, quick, decisive, fed the check into it. The blades clicked. A faint whirring filled the air. White fragments of what was once a symbol of long-awaited justice fluttered into the bin below. Harold didn't speak. The people behind him in line had gone quiet. A woman gasped. A man muttered something under his breath. Even the security guard shifted uncomfortably. Emma, for her part, seemed unfazed. "If it was legitimate," she said with a shrug, "you can always request a replacement, but we can't process this today." Harold picked up his ID slowly. His fingers trembled, not from age, but from something older, the cold ache of betrayal. He looked at her, not with anger, but with quiet disbelief. Then he turned back straight and walked out the door without a word. The sun outside felt hotter now. Or maybe it was the burn of knowing that even after a lifetime of service, he was still invisible to some. But Harold wasn't done. He knew who to call. Harold Monroe eased himself onto the metal bench just outside the bank. The kind bolted to the sidewalk facing a parking lot that shimmered under the California sun. His hands, still trembling, rested on his knees. For a long moment, he said nothing, just breathed. He wasn't angry in the way most people understood it. This was older, colder, a stillness that came when someone had crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed. A line painted in the blood of service, sacrifice, and silence. With a deep inhale, Harold reached inside his jacket and pulled out a weathered flip phone. Not many numbers were stored inside, but one sat at the very top, untouched for years. He pressed it. The phone rang once, then again, a click. Then a voice, calm, familiar, slightly older, but unmistakable. "Easton here." "Ray," Harold said, his voice quiet but steady. "It's Harold Monroe." A pause. "Harold," then sharper, "what's going on?" Harold explained slowly, clearly. The check, the teller, the shredder, the humiliation. Raymond Easton didn't interrupt, but Harold could hear his old friend's breathing change, a kind of still fury only a few men could carry without raising their voice. "You're at the bank now?" Raymond asked. "Outside, sitting on a bench." "Don't move," Easton said, crisp and immediate. "I mean it. Stay right where you are." For a moment, Harold was taken back years ago. Another desert, a different war. Gulf War, 1991. Easton was a young colonel overseeing a multi-vehicle convoy hauling munitions through a sandstorm in southern Iraq. A wrong turn put them in range of mortar fire. Confused, disoriented, his men freezing up. But Harold, then a senior sergeant in logistics, calm under fire, routed the entire convoy out using nothing but a compass, grit, and a torn map marked in grease pencil. He had saved 47 soldiers that day. Easton never forgot. Now, decades later, that same cool-headed sergeant sat quietly on a bench, his honor insulted, his trust shredded like the check he had earned. "Harold," Easton said again, his voice now tighter, "you gave me your word back then. I owe you mine now, and I still carry a bit more weight than I did in 91. Give me 10 minutes. Harold closed the phone and folded his hands. He didn't know what Easton would do, but he knew what kind of man he was, and that was enough. Harold didn't wait long. 8 minutes, maybe 10, had passed since he'd hung up the phone. He hadn't moved from the bench, hadn't taken another call, hadn't even checked his watch. He just sat there, still, observant, and strangely calm. Then the sedans arrived. 2 of them, black, low-slung with tinted windows and unmarked plates. They didn't come roaring in. No sirens, no drama. Just a sharp turn into the bank's front parking lot and quick, deliberate stops. It wasn't a spectacle. It was precision. 4 people stepped out. 2 men, 2 women, all in tailored dark suits, sunglasses, earpieces, and purposeful strides. 1 woman carried a thin black briefcase. One of the men wore a lapel pin shaped like an eagle in flight. They moved not like visitors, but like people who already owned the room they were walking into. Harold didn't smile. He just adjusted his cap. Inside the bank, the atmosphere changed instantly. Conversations fell quiet. Keyboards stopped clicking. Emma, behind her teller window, glanced up and immediately looked unsure of what she was seeing. The group flashed federal identification without raising their voices. Treasury Department, Office of the Controller of the Currency, Internal Audit Division. Manager on site? The lead woman asked sharply. The branch manager, a mid-level man named Carl Devlin, looked up from his desk just in time to be met by two agents stepping directly into his office. The other two approached Emma. "Miss Emma Caldwell," the man asked. She nodded, blinking. "You'll come with us, please?" Emma stammered. "Is this about the check?" Immediately, the woman added, her voice flat. They brought her into a side room while the audit team set up at the manager's terminal. Screens were turned, logs accessed. One agent pulled up the teller station surveillance footage. The image was crystal clear. Harold Monroe standing at the window, check in hand, his voice calm, his documents placed on the counter, and then without escalation, without consulting a manager, without attempting verification, Emma feeding the check into the shredder. Inside the side room, her hands began to tremble. I thought it was fake," she said. "Based on what?" asked Agent Malik, the man across from her. The paper felt wrong, and the amount. It was a lot. "We don't usually see treasury checks like that." "Did you scan the routing number?" Yes, but it didn't match what I'm used to." "Did you contact your manager?" "No, I didn't want it to be cashed if it was fraudulent." "So, you shredded a treasury instrument based on a feeling?" Emma looked down. "I thought I was following policy." "You were not," said Agent Malik, flipping open a binder. "Page 17, paragraph 3 of your bank's protocol for questionable instruments. In all cases involving suspected federal documents, escalate immediately to a floor supervisor or utilize the designated Federal Verification Hotline. Destruction of federal instruments is prohibited without explicit managerial approval or confirmed Treasury fraud flag." Emma's eyes widened as she read the policy she'd skipped during onboarding. Back in the lobby, Devlin was sweating under the scrutiny. The agents were now printing copies of every check processed at Emma's station for the last 72 hours. Camera feeds were saved to a secure drive. A call had already been placed to Consolidated Trust Regional Headquarters. Then came the final blow. "Miss Caldwell is suspended effective immediately," one agent announced. "And the Treasury Secretary has personally requested a preliminary report by end of business today," another added. Harold, still seated on the bench outside, watched the agents re-enter their cars without ceremony. No drama, just execution. The system that failed him an hour ago had just corrected itself faster and louder than anyone inside that bank could have imagined. And it wasn't done yet. From his bench on the sidewalk, Harold Monroe sat like a stone sentinel, watching, silent, steady. The black sedans were still parked outside. Inside, heads turned toward the front desk where suited agents had taken over the branch like they'd rehearsed it. But Harold didn't need to see the details. He could feel it. The shift, the tension, the quiet panic of people realizing they'd done something very, very wrong. A few minutes later, the glass doors opened again. Emma stepped out first. She wasn't escorted roughly, but she wasn't walking on her own terms either. One agent walked just behind her, the other beside her as she moved stiffly down the bank steps. Her posture was no longer confident. Her shoulders slumped, her face pale and rigid, avoided eye contact with Harold entirely. She didn't need to look. She knew he was there. Behind her, Carl Devlin, the branch manager, stood inside the lobby with a paper in his hand and a regional executive whispering urgently over his shoulder. Devlin looked like a man who'd been hit without warning, a corporate soldier caught in the crossfire. He wouldn't lose his job that day, but he wouldn't be trusted again either. The agents had recommended immediate probation and mandatory federal compliance retraining. That was their polite way of saying, "You're lucky to still be standing." The glass door closed. The agents stepped outside. One gave Harold a small nod of acknowledgement. Not a salute, but something close. Respectful. Earned. Then Harold's phone buzzed. He pulled it from his jacket slowly. The caller ID said U.S. Treasury Private Line. He answered. Monroe. Harold, came a firm, warm voice. This is Secretary Daniels. Harold sat up straighter. Even after all these years, the tone of a high-ranking official still triggered his old instincts. Sir, I just read the preliminary report from our agents on site, the secretary said. Let me be clear. This isn't just about a check. This is about respect, about how our institutions treat the people who've carried this nation on their backs. And I'm deeply sorry for what you endured today. Harold was quiet. We've already processed a full replacement payment, Daniels continued. It's being deposited electronically into your account. You should see it by the end of the day. $76,400, same amount, no delays. Harold exhaled slowly. Thank you, sir. No, the secretary replied, his voice firm. Thank you, Staff Sergeant, for your patience, your service, and for reminding us what happens when people forget who they're serving. The call ended as cleanly as it had begun. Harold looked up. The sky was clear. The breeze was warmer now. The same check that had been treated like a burden by one bank teller had been restored, not just in money, but in meaning. And for the first time in a very long time, Harold Monroe didn't feel like a forgotten soldier. He felt seen. Harold Monroe's story didn't go viral because of a check. It resonated because it exposed something deeper. Something that had been festering in the corners of American conscience for decades. The quiet, casual neglect of those who served. From Vietnam to Iraq to the sands of Kuwait and the mountains of Afghanistan. American veterans have come home not to cheers, but to silence, sometimes even suspicion. Ask any Vietnam veteran what it felt like to step off the plane in 1972. Many will tell you about the shame. Not theirs, but the country's. Instead of gratitude, they got jeers, protesters. A society that didn't distinguish the war from the warrior. And so they did what Harold did. They buried their pain, went home, and carried on. Then came the Gulf War. Short, swift, and televised. Americans cheered, but quietly moved on. Veterans came home to a country that thanked them with parades, then forgot to follow up with healthcare. Thousands reported strange illnesses, undiagnosed rashes, breathing issues, neurological symptoms. It would take over a decade for the government to admit that Gulf War syndrome was even real. And in more recent times, those who served in OIF and OEF operations, Iraqi freedom and enduring freedom, faced their own battles. Burn pits, traumatic brain injuries, PTSD, delayed claims, endless paperwork, suicide hotlines jammed, clinics understaffed. So when Harold walked into that bank, check in hand, it wasn't just about one veteran. It was about all of them. He was carrying every weight, listed medical claim, every delayed benefit, every missed call from a government office. And when that teller shredded his check, she wasn't just destroying a piece of paper. She was tearing open a wound that never really healed. What hit people hardest about Harold's story wasn't the drama of federal sedans or the swiftness of the audit. It was the quiet dignity of a man who never asked for special treatment. A man who waited decades and still walked in with politeness. A man who only picked up the phone when every other door was slammed in his face. There are countless Harolds in America, and many of them don't make the news. Like the veteran in Missouri who was denied treatment at a private hospital because the staff didn't understand VA billing. He died in the waiting room. Or the Marine in Pennsylvania whose PTSD medication ran out because his claim got lost in the system. Or the World War II nurse in Oregon whose identity was doubted when she tried to use her outdated VA ID at a pharmacy. These aren't just anecdotes, they're warnings. The deeper issue is this. Many older Americans, especially veterans, feel forgotten. They stood in line when duty called, but now they stand in lines for care, for respect, even just to be heard. And too often the systems built to support them, banks, hospitals, bureaucracies, treat them as relics instead of pillars. Harold's story hit a nerve because it reminded us what service looks like when the uniform comes off. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It stands quietly, waiting its turn until someone pushes too far. And when that line is crossed, the response isn't rage, it's resolve. We must do better. Not just with benefits, but with the everyday respect that every veteran has earned, not through grand gestures, but through basic decency, recognition, humanity. Because the real tragedy isn't that a check was shredded. It's that Harold Monroe didn't expect better. And that's what needs to change. There's a difference between policy and principle. A difference too many have forgotten. Emma Caldwell may have claimed she was following protocol, but what she truly followed was fear. She saw something she didn't recognize. And instead of asking questions, she acted fast, without context, without care. Her decision to shred a U.S. Treasury check wasn't rooted in training. It was rooted in assumption. Policy exists to protect institutions. Principle exists to protect people. Emma followed neither. She bypassed every escalation step, ignored the veteran ID handed to her, and shredded what she didn't understand. Not because she was cruel, but because she was unseasoned. She mistook authority for understanding, and her impulse wasn't grounded in knowledge. It was grounded in doubt. This is the quiet crisis in many modern institutions, the loss of generational wisdom. There was a time when younger employees learned by watching. When respect for elders wasn't just a courtesy, it was a code. But somewhere along the way, process replaced mentorship and instinct replaced reflection. The result, decisions made from fear of being wrong, not from the desire to get it right. And that's what makes Harold Monroe stand apart. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand attention. He stood there, dignified, steady, rooted in something deeper than pride. He knew what the check meant. He knew who he was. And he knew that panic, especially in the face of injustice, solves nothing. Where Emma responded with suspicion, Harold responded with silence. Where she moved quickly, he moved deliberately. Where she acted from fear, he held on to grace. That moment in the bank wasn't just about a shredded check. It was about what happens when institutions stop listening. And when experience is replaced with ego, Harold didn't need a lecture to teach the lesson. He just stood still. And sometimes that's the loudest message of all. Within 72 hours, the bank issued a formal public apology. It wasn't buried in fine print. It ran in the local paper, posted on the branch doors, and circulated across social media. Consolidated Trust Bank acknowledged its failure, not just procedural, but personal. They called Harold Monroe by name. They called him a veteran. They called what happened a grave error in judgment. Emma Caldwell was quietly dismissed. The regional manager who once defended her actions was reassigned. The branch underwent immediate retraining, not just in Treasury protocol, but in respect-based interaction, particularly with veterans and the elderly. And from Washington, real change followed. The Treasury Department rolled out new mandatory training across all federally insured financial institutions, a module titled Veterans Are Not Variables. It emphasized the human element behind the paperwork, the earned dignity behind every VA-issued document, and the long road many veterans travel just to receive what they're owed. But Harold Monroe didn't care much for the noise. He didn't need the cameras or the credit. The following Friday, he packed a small duffel bag, folded his military jacket carefully, and walked down to the bus depot. The check, reissued and deposited, had cleared. His roof would be fixed when he got back. His bills were paid, but for now he had somewhere to be. As the Greyhound pulled out of Bakersfield and pointed north, Harold took the window seat, rested his chin on his hand, and stared out at the horizon. In Eugene, Oregon, a boy named Caleb was waiting, about to meet his grandfather for the first time. And Harold, he was finally on a journey that didn't require battle plans, paperwork, or patience, just presence. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a check. It was about recognition, about the quiet dignity of a man who gave everything and asked for nothing, and what happens when a system forgets the people it's meant to serve. Harold Monroe didn't raise his voice. He didn't storm the bank or demand a headline. He stood still. And somehow that stillness spoke louder than outrage ever could. In today's fast-paced world, it's easy to dismiss someone who moves slower, speaks softer, or carries themselves with old-school humility. But maybe that's where we've gone wrong. Maybe what we need more of are people like Harold. People who remind us that principle should never be buried under policy and that respect must never depend on how someone looks, dresses, or what year their ID was issued. So, let me ask you, have you ever witnessed someone quietly do the right thing and be ignored for it, or rewarded? Do you think today's younger generation is losing the deeper sense of respect, or are they simply not being taught? Let's talk about it in the comments. Your story might just be the one someone else needs to hear. Thank you for spending time with us today at Valor Stories. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe. We're building a space where voices like Harold's aren't just heard, but honored. Because in the end, silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's legacy.